Contrary to popular misconceptions, Star Wars is not in any way, shape, or form related to B-movies. It's related to film serials. Consequently, that was where Lucas and his producer, Gary Kurtz, looked when they were considering what to do with the massive success that they had. Gone now was Splinter of the Mind's Eye for a sequel. It had been deliberately crafted with the assumption that they would have a low-budget Star Wars. Well, Star Wars 2 would not only have a bigger budget, it would have to have one. If the film was going to follow up the gargantuan success of the original, it simply had to be another astonishing work. But they were already thinking beyond Star Wars 2. They were thinking that this is so big, and the tools all right there for them to use, that they could turn Star Wars into a franchise like James Bond was. And so, since film serials had tended to be 12 episodes long, so too would Star Wars be the first of a 12-episode saga. As has been previously mentioned, Lucas was constantly coming up with and discarding ideas. So you might be thinking that this is just another one of those, a passing idea much like having Luke be a girl, that Lucas quickly discarded. But in fact, 12 episodes wasn't the plan for a week or a month. It was the plan for more than 2 years. It was the plan during most of the production of Star Wars 2, regularly referenced in interviews and even in the official newsletter for the company. The film series was planned to run like clockwork into the 21st century, being directed by others along the way, with Lucas likely to direct the final one himself, to be the one to close the curtain on this triumphant series of films. Part of the reason for this ambitious undertaking was to ensure that there would be a reliable source of income for his company, or rather, companies. Lucas was hard at work with lawyers to transform all the different companies that had been created to fund and manufacture Star Wars and turn them into a sustainable business. But that itself was not what Lucas was concerned with. They were likewise a means to an end, but not the end itself. What Lucas had was a dream, and that dream was of taking the American zoetrope idea to fullest flower. Lucas wanted a place where, like in film school, filmmakers could come and collaborate, work together, and get much-needed breaks together without it interfering in their work. This period was the heyday for so many creative people like Lucas because of this sort of cross-pollination. I talked about the influence that other creators, such as Brian De Palma, had on Star Wars, but that wasn't an isolated incident. They did that all the time with their movies, more drawing of feedback and understanding of what worked and what didn't as they crafted their films. It's no coincidence that many of these people made the best films of their careers during this era, when they had the strengths of each other to draw upon and make their bad films good and their good films great, and to make Star Wars the most successful film of all. Lucas's vision was for a place that could be all of that and more, and he would call it Skywalker Ranch. So Lucas put everything he had into creating a filmmaking empire, one that would produce one hit Star Wars movie after the next for decades to come, and the profits to then be channeled into making Skywalker Ranch all that he dreamed it could be. It was to have state-of-the-art facilities, places where people could work on numerous aspects of filmmaking, could screen movies for others to elicit feedback, have recreational downtime, and on top of that, be a working ranch too, with the fruits of their labor, figuratively and sometimes even literally, being enjoyed by those working there. However successful his companies might be, whatever would become of Star Wars, Skywalker Ranch was to become George Lucas's legacy. As described in the book Fathers of Influence, quote, "In his mind, Hollywood was evil, greedy, and encouraged mediocrity. Skywalker Ranch, on the other hand, would be an ideal studio, respecting human values, innovation, and creativity. And there would be no expense spared. It would look like a 19th century mansion on the outside, perfectly fitting the look of a post-Civil War rancher, and inside a mixture of cutting-edge technology and old-world charm, including redwood timber reclaimed from a dismantled bridge. And it would also have an astonishing library for reference purposes, crowned with absolutely stunning stained glass. It would cost millions upon millions of dollars to realize this dream, of course, but Lucas had the plan. He had the most popular franchise of this area. If he could see this through to completion, this could become a reality. However, that dream would be a long time coming. And while it had a noble end, the journey there was not going to be easy, and there would be some darkness along the way. Star Wars licensing would become a juggernaut, but there wasn't a whole lot of that available just yet. The action figures wouldn't hit stores' shelves until the following year, and bootleg products were springing up all over the place and siphoning money away from legitimate merchandise. And the Marvel comic was license-free for the first 5 issues, a brilliant move from a film marketing standpoint. But now, though, it was being perceived as a means of cutting into the profits that they could have been getting. Between all of these things, it was perceived by many within the company as being a failure to capitalize on the success, despite the fact that this was unprecedented, and that they were in many ways creating an entirely new kind of business the way that they were trying to both promote and capitalize upon the film. With the transformation of those short-term companies into an ongoing business, Lucas began drawing upon established Hollywood veterans. The company was structured to follow his vision, to avoid the things that he hated about the Hollywood system. But nevertheless, it wasn't long before Gary Kurtz was starting to get annoyed at how Lucasfilm was transforming from the entity that it had been when they were making Star Wars into just another corporation. All this talk about creativity for filmmakers, and yet there were suddenly dress codes and reports and bureaucracy. And of course, people coming in after the fact second-guessing your decisions. And given what happened with marketing, it's no surprise that the one most second-guessed was Charles Lippincott. He had gone to the mat for Star Wars. In fact, he'd broken the law for Star Wars. One of the promotional events he'd set up was a radio show appearance. Except before showing up, Harrison Ford had smoked a joint and was clearly stoned during the interview. A nightmare for anyone trying to promote a family-friendly film. Well, to make matters worse, as if that were somehow possible, Harrison's father called up during the show and dressed down his son on live radio. Knowing the PR disaster that this was becoming, Lippincott, who was familiar with the studio, snuck in and stole the master tape of the interview and made off with it into the night to dispose of the evidence. Now, you might not approve of that, but the one thing you can never say was that Lippincott was not doing his damnedest for Star Wars. And yet, accusations would be thrown around that he gave away the license rights to Kenner for $50 in a handshake, that millions in sales were lost because of him, none of which were true. It's easy to make deals and move product for the biggest hit of all time. Not so easy when you've got an unproven property that insiders say is going to tank. Yet just over a year after the tremendous success of Star Wars, Lippincott was shown the door. Also, John Dykstra was becoming a persona non grata despite his pivotal role in the development of ILM. It was no secret that he and Lucas clashed repeatedly during the making of Star Wars, and when it was finished, ILM was shut down. Dykstra went on to his next project, something for Universal being developed by Glenn Larson called Galactica, Saga of a Star World. Dykstra was to create the special effects needed for this primetime science fiction show, and so they wound up renting the very equipment that Dykstra had helped to develop for ILM in order to make these effects. And he wasn't alone. Not only were many of the former ILM employees now working for Dykstra, but Ralph McQuarrie, he was working there as well. The success of Star Wars had made McQuarrie's work very much in demand. Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Star Trek the Motion Picture, and even covers for Star Wars books. With so much overlap, the fact that ILM was renting the equipment for Galactica's production and that Universal wanted to maintain a positive relationship with Lucas, work was underway for the sequel to American Graffiti. They sent the material over to Lucas to ensure that there weren't going to be any hard feelings. But there were. There were many elements of the version that was sent to Lucas that he felt were clearly using Star Wars. Now, as was discussed at length, the drawing upon the works of others is fine, but it does require doing something notable with it. And in some cases, it seemed to Lucas like they were just copying Star Wars outright. The Cylon robots looking too similar to stormtroopers, for example. Now, keep in mind that while making Star Wars, he had changed the most important ship in that entire film because it was too similar to the ship that was being used on a television program that had come out first. So in his mind, there was nothing unreasonable about saying, however you reached this point, it's clearly too similar to what I already did, please change it. So because of this, there were a few changes made, such as renaming the series Battlestar Galactica. But not everything he asked for was done. Galactica would prove to be a real sore spot for Lucas and a source of conflict between 20th Century Fox and MCA Universal, part of which being that the equipment Dykstra was using was going to be needed to make Star Wars 2. While many people who worked on Battlestar Galactica would return to work on the Star Wars sequel, Dykstra would not be amongst them, and among the Lucasfilm halls, he was considered by many to be a traitor. Even Gary Kurtz was not safe from the transformation that was taking place. With all the restructuring, Lucas was looking to get a new producer in for the sequel, feeling that Kurtz had failed to do his job effectively on Star Wars. But after the two hashed it out for a while and Kurtz pointed out all that he had done and how loyal he had remained to Lucas throughout everything, Lucas changed his mind and Kurtz stayed on as the producer, though this was going to be a very different relationship than when they had made Star Wars. No longer the director and the producer, it was an employer and an employee. Not that there's anything wrong with that, certainly, but it is important to note this distinction because of what would eventually happen over the making of the film that Kurtz suggested they call The Empire Strikes Back. But Lucas was adamant about one thing. He was not going to direct the next film. So they began seeing a number of directors to see who might be up to the challenge. It would not be easy, because both sides would have deep concerns. When you direct the sequel, it's a lose-lose in many cases. If it's a hit, it's only because the first film was a hit. And if it's a dud, it's your fault because the first film was a hit, so you must have screwed up. And on the flip side, if the director doesn't believe in the material, the work can suffer. Finding someone who would do Empire justice and wouldn't be afraid of the material was hard. So the person Kurtz approached finally was Irvin Kershner. Kershner had overseen some student projects at USC, and so had interacted with Lucas a few times, and Kurtz had done some minor work for him previously. After Kurtz had felt him out over the project, Lucas himself contacted Kershner. Kershner had a feeling that he knew what this was about, so when Lucas brought up directing Empire, Kershner was naturally hesitant. But Lucas understood him very well, and so rather than downplaying the challenges, Lucas laid out the miserable experience he had making Star Wars. It was belly crawling over ground glass, and yet you had to produce a work that emphasized both action and heart, the kind of directing task that would break a lesser man, and nearly broke Lucas himself. So Kershner was here because Lucas wasn't sure anybody could possibly do this, but if anyone could, it was probably Kershner. It's a Herculean task, but perhaps you're up to it. Kershner admits the flattery worked. His stipulation was that he wanted Empire to be an even better film than Star Wars was, and Lucas welcomed the chance for Kershner to make a better film. But there were some concerns beyond the obvious. First, Kershner wanted assurances that he was going to be making his film, not that he was going to be directing by proxy what Lucas wanted. Second, he didn't know anything about special effects, so he needed some assurances there, which Lucas was happy to provide because they were working to rebuild ILM in the Bay Area. Just tell them what you want and they'll make it, Lucas assured him. Third was a bit of a sticking point. Kershner wanted to have an Irvin Kershner film listed at the beginning, but Lucas wanted all 12 films to have the same opening. And it wasn't just Kershner, but the Directors Guild of America that expected that kind of upfront credit. In the end, that seemingly unimportant four-word phrase would cause a significant impact upon the following film. In fact, it's possible that it changed the entire direction of the franchise. During this time, Lucas had been quietly buying up the land that he would need to eventually fulfill his dream. He would have to get approval from Marine County for the project, which meant everything had to be paid in cash, no bank loans, because there was no way to guarantee that they wouldn't shut it down before the whole thing even started. But eventually the go-ahead was given from the authorities, and Skywalker Ranch could now officially be pursued. Lucas invited Kershner into his office and laid out all of the building plans that had been drawn up. This, he said, this is why we're doing it. This is why we're making this movie. But what exactly was The Empire Strikes Back? Clearly, everything that had been planned for the sequel was now obsolete. Coming up with a story was going to be vital because it was the story as much as the special effects that made Star Wars such a hit. And yet right now, there wasn't the foggiest idea of what this movie would be about.